And now, please welcome Drama Desk Tony and Academy Award winner, Mr. Tony Walton. Hello to everyone in the historic Coolidge Auditorium of the Library of Congress here, and those watching online. We are thrilled to be celebrating the 40th anniversary of The Wiz and highlighting the acquisition of the Tony Walton collection. Before we ease into this, I suppose a little introduction is necessary. My name is Solomon HaileSelassie, and I am the production manager here, the music division. But more importantly, I am, well, thank you very much. More importantly, I am a movie nerd and a lover of The Wiz. I got my first copy of The Wiz on VHS in 1995. Oh. It was one of only 5 movies I watched growing up: Jurassic Park, Alan Quatermain and the Lost City of Gold, The Wizard of Speed and Time, no one's ever heard of that, Star Wars, and The Wiz. I've watched it maybe 200 times. I own it on every format, including the Laserdisc. It is one of my all-time favorite movies, and I'm very excited to be interviewing you. Tony is the production designer and the winner of countless awards and accolades, and we're so pleased to have him here today.
Thank you so much. Could we introduce my tiny bride?
Oh, yes.
Sitting next to the mighty Sue Vita is my wife, Genevieve. And I may be shrieking out to her from time to time, what was that? When did we? Whatever I somehow can't get through my own tired, ancient brain.
Well, speaking of brains, tell us what is in the brain of a production designer. What does that person do?
Well, excuse me, in this particular instance, I'm both production designer and the costume designer. And that's not very often the case. In fact, it's rather rare. Is there a problem? Oh. Was I covering the mic? Okay. Well, a production designer in movies has the responsibility of trying to make available for the director and the director of cinematography the materials through which they can select what the essential vision or moment-by-moment image may be to tell the story. Very different than in the theater, where the designer has the responsibility of kind of establishing whatever the original nature of this piece is, and so that the audience receives whatever story we're telling through what the designer establishes on stage. And it's through that sort of visual funnel that the audience receives the story. In movies, it's the director and the cinematographer who select what it's going to look like and what will show whenever. And it's very, very rare that a production and costume designer is invited to actually look through the lens and see whether he approves the imagery being shown. I've been very lucky, and partly because I've worked a lot with the same people. So Ozzie Morris, who was the sort of archbishop of cinema in England, used to pause when he was ready for Sydney to start shooting and say, just give me a moment to have Tony check this. And I was always extraordinarily thrilled to be involved in that way, because you feel like that in the theater, but you don't in the movies. And so it was wonderful to be a participator in whatever the ultimate visual product was going to be.
And designing is not a job that is foreign to you. In fact, you are a living legend to movie and theater nerds like myself. A quick look at your credits, and I'm going to try and do this in one breath. I'm not going to make it. Your credits: The Rehearsal, Equus, Golden Boy, Apple Tree, Pippin, Uncle Vanya, The Good Doctor, Heartbird, Sophisticated Ladies, Fahrenheit 451, The Cripple of Inishmaan, Little Me, The Real Thing, Anything Goes, Waiting for Godot, Grand Hotel, The Will Rogers Follies, Moonlight, The Grass Menagerie, Death and the Maiden, Company, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Guys and Dolls, She Loves Me, Annie Get Your Gun, Seussical, Our Town, A Tale of Two Cities, The Seagull, Death Trap, Death of a Salesman, Sleeping Beauty, Peter and the Wolf, Tosca, Murder on the Orient Express, All That Jazz, Chicago, Mary Poppins, and The Wiz, to name just a few.
Could I have a little bit of a laugh?
You have designed sets, costumes, and projection on Broadway, television, and for major motion pictures for over 60 years. How did you start this whirlwind career?
I hope it's all right to repeat something that I said to our gang this morning.
This morning, earlier, we had a group of 30 students from Duke Ellington, the Studio Theater, and Catholic University who came and had lunch with Tony.
So, some of what I'm about to say, in case any of that gang happens to be here, will be somewhat repetitious. Please forgive me. But I had no plan to be a designer. It wasn't even something I was particularly aware of. However, I was aware that my dad, who was a very fine and rather famous surgeon, led an extraordinarily wonderful life, helping people through ill health, and in fact, setting up the original Sister Kenny polio clinics all over the world, and seeing patients at our home. And so we, the family, were able to observe how destroyed he would be if he lost one of his kid patients to polio. So that's what I thought I would do, and possibly become a useful human being. But unfortunately, the subjects that I focused on in school and college, the ones that lead you on to what will be the college you go to, were the medically related subjects, and physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. And those were the subjects that I did least well in. So the teachers at my school decided I should be put in the classics removed and have an old Greek and Latin formal education. And we had acres of Virgil and Ovid and the other classical writers to learn in their own language, Greek or Latin, and would have to memorize and, so to say, act out a piece from Cicero or whoever. And it was very tiresome for most of my fellow students, and to some great degree to me too, because it wasn't a subject that I'd actually chosen to go in. I just ended being dumped there. So on one occasion, to try and lighten the load for my friends and fellow students, I offered a monologue that was written in sort of Liverpudlian, the accent that the Beatles spoke in, about Albert and the Lion. And it was a very silly poem, and it was about Albert and his parents going to Blackpool for the summer. And the weather was quite disappointing. The waves, they was piddling and small. There was no wrecks, and nobody drowned. In fact, nothing to laugh at all. But my fellow students did laugh and enjoyed it a lot. But my classics teacher booted me out of the class. And in an attempt to find some other alternate life, the school sent me to an art school in Oxford, weirdly called the City of Oxford School of Technology, Art and Commerce. A very Ruskinian kind of school, although there was also the Ruskin Art School there in Oxford, but I didn't get to go to that one. Once they had lodged me erratically there in the art school, my overall educational force and the art school never really had much further communication as to where I was. So each sort of assumed if I wasn't with them, I must be with the other one, which afforded me some freedom to select time off whenever I felt like it, during which I made marionette productions, string marionette productions. I had done some sort of somewhat marionette-like figures made mostly out of tin cans. You'll see a little sort of latter-day reference to it in the Tin Man in the movie. And I used to make figures of famous politicians, and so it would be someone like Churchill or even Hitler out of these tin cans and bottles and things. And I would throw Hitler into our little pond in the garden, and because of the nature of the bottles and cans, it would glug its way to its doom. And I enjoyed that, and then went on from there to do rather more ambitious creatures who, for example, on one occasion we did a very full production of Mozart's Magic Flute. And I was a teenager, and like many idiot teenagers, I enjoyed wearing many different hats. So I designed the characters and their costumes and the scenery and eventually the lighting. And on the day of the first performance, we had an unlucky happenstance. The student who was just about to sing the part of Papageno, which I was also operating, got laryngitis. So I had to take that over too at the last moment. And it just so happened that a great English fine artist called John Piper, very famous in England, so we all knew what he looked like, and when it was pointed out that he was there, we were all doubly nervous. He came back at the end of the performance and said, and I had all these credits in the playbill. My favorite credit was Maker of Faces, Tony Walton. And of course that was about the faces for the marionettes, not the faces that I was making. And Piper came backstage and he stood there looking like a medieval saint, as if he'd stepped right out of a stained glass window. And he said, "Which one is Walton?" And I very nervously popped up a finger. And he said, "You should do this." And I said, "What is this?" He said, "You should put on shows, make productions, and make magic in the theater." So it hadn't crossed my mind, but he said he was still a teacher emeritus at the Slade School of Fine Art in London. And so he sent me there. And I just sort of by accident ended up studying theatre design and design in general at this fabulous art school. It was sort of the opposite to the Royal Academy School of Art, which was very classical and traditional. Slade was much more adventurous and plucky, and many of our better painters and designers came through there. So I was extraordinarily lucky to have had nothing to do with the fact that I ended up there myself. And I paid my way there by acting in fits and starts at Wimbledon Repertory Theatre, which is the repertory theatre near the famous tennis courts. And we put on a new production every 2 weeks. And the first production that I performed in, despite the fact that I'd been a very cocky performer in school and college, the first one I performed in by a bizarre coincidence, laryngitis struck again. And it was my sister who was also in the production. And I was given my sister's lines in addition to my own for opening night. So I was a little jumpy. And at the end, or somewhere in the midst of the performance, thought, these good people have actually paid real money to watch me do this. You know, got hopelessly self-conscious and was very aware that I was not being a good actor. So at the end of the performance, I said to the actor manager of the theatre, is there something else I could do to keep earning my 10 guineas a week? 3 guineas a week, 3 guineas. It was sort of $10 worth a week. And he said, well, we always need stagehands, so if you'd like to do that, we'll pay you 3 guineas a week for that. And that was an extraordinary education on its own, because it was all the nuts and bolts of dealing with design, whereas the stage school was entirely idealistic, and they wouldn't even teach you how to do a ground plan or technical drawings. They'd just say, make a pretty model and have the scenic shop say, we can do that, or, you know, and you can even get them to put in their own suggestions. So all this sounded terrific, but it wasn't that helpful in the actual nuts and bolts process of coming up with designs. So the combination of trying to make sense of these two totally opposed kinds of learning about making theatre was very, very productive for me, and I, again, was extraordinarily lucky to have that.
And success came early for you. You designed Forum for Broadway and then the film before you were 30, is that right?
Right.
And then Mary Poppins shortly after that.
Yes. And I was lucky in that when Walt Disney came in to see Julie in Camelot, because members of his creative team had recommended he take a look at her as a possible Mary Poppins, he didn't want to go see it with any kind of wear and tear from the flight. So he decided that evening to go to a nearby show, which just so happened to be a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. And he is a fanatical fan of vaudevillians, and this cast of Forum were mostly vaudevillians. As you probably know, most of you, many of his characters, Jiminy Cricket was a famous vaudevillian called Ukulele Ike, and many of the cast of Mary Poppins were vaudevillians too. Uncle Albert, Edwin, and the first nanny, who was the wife of Charles Lawton, Elsa Lanchester, take it to what you said. And the family cook, all of these people had been famous or infamous vaudevillians, and Disney just loved that world. So he went to see the show that had all these vaudevillians in it, and by lucky chance I was the costume and scenic designer for that. So by the time he visited Julie at the matinee the next day and went back to her dressing room afterwards, he saw that there were designs on the wall that seemed to be by the same designer as Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. So when I was brought in and introduced to him, he said, I think maybe you should, we're going to need an English designer on this story anyway, so I think maybe you should bring your portfolio along when you come with Julie to see all the storyboards we've done and hear the score and so on. And I said, we've actually just decided we shouldn't really ever work together on the same project because times of tension can coincide, as they had been, they've just been recently for us, when Julie was in My Fair Lady in London, and she used to do a weekly BBC show called the Julie Andrews Hour, which I had designed, and frequently I was embroiled in some challenge at a time when she really would have enjoyed some input from somebody familiar to her. So we had made this decision, and Disney was very surprised at this and said, but I happen to know that before too long, you will both be having a baby. It's not that many months away. And so you want to be in the movie studios in Los Angeles when your wife and first child are still in London. He said, that's not smart. Surely you want to be involved with them in the early days of your baby. So I said, well, I guess so. And after all, you're Walt Disney, you know a lot more than this about all this than I do. So I did, I'm thinking of it as succumbing, but of course had the lucky big break of a lifetime for anybody who worked in the movies, because working at Disney's was like being in a candy store. You couldn't help but learn the most amazing things every day, all the time. And I was a theatre snob and had still got a couple of productions to complete and launch in London, so I was zooming back and forth. And Walter asked me to check on P.L. Travers, the author of Mary Poppins books, and try to assure her that all was going well, because she had been extremely hard to seduce into giving him the rights to the books. And I don't know if I should just also mention that Disney said I'd had a nightmare predicament following me around and visiting my dreams, which is that I finally secured the rights after 4 years of pursuing P.L. Travers, but I never was able to get the rights to the illustrations of the books, because they were done by the daughter of Ernest Shepard, who did all the Winnie the Pooh books and The Wind in the Willows and so forth. And the estate of E.H. Shepard doesn't approve of the fact that we have attempted to make the Shepard drawings a little more cozy in our movie shorts of the Winnie the Pooh stories. He said, so I haven't had a prayer of getting the rights of Mary Shepard's illustrations. So here's the predicament. Your job is to make every character in the movie recognizable from the illustrations in the stories that many of our audience will be familiar with. But you cannot use any detail of any of the costumes they're wearing in the illustrations.
Sure.
So that was
Easy.
it.
Easy. Done.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that'll be a big
Do it overnight.
Luckily, after a few days, he suddenly thought we could move it back in time, the whole story. So I did have the advantage of changing the lengths of skirts and things like that. But it was a big challenge. And a friend of mine who is the designer of the Broadway production, stage production of Mary Poppins, came to me and said, what am I going to do? Please forgive me if I accidentally rip you off. And I said, well, I know it's a predicament because I had a sort of similar one on the movie. I thought I would be able to follow the look of the original characters, but I wasn't permitted to. And he, God bless him, made his own version of pretty much everything for the stage version of the show. Perhaps the chimney sweeps are familiar from one to the other. But Mary Poppins is very different, as she is in Mary Poppins Returns, the movie that is due to come out just before Christmas, I think. The wonderful Emily Blunt, who plays Mary Poppins, is dressed somewhat like the famous Margaret Lockwood in things like Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, very famous movie. Emily Blunt looks more like her than she looks like Mary Poppins or Julie. And as I say, I worship her as an actress, but Julie was had also that sort of vaudevillian background from a very early age. So she was just she was, in her own mind, Mary Poppins, and I gave her, as she mentioned in this little interview, these brilliantly shocking colors for the linings of her costumes. And Bob Crowley, who designed the Broadway production, didn't use any of that at all. The only person who did was the producer of it, Cameron McIntosh, who for the poster logo and the advertisements exactly duplicated my original costume design from the movie. I mentioned that to him once. I said, when something like that gets used, does the original creator get some sort of compensation?
That's right.
He said,
That's right.
He said, oh, you are a funny fella.
Here we are 40 years and 2 days after it was released to talk about a little movie called The Wiz. Did you ever think that you would be giving an interview in 2018 about The Wiz?
No, certainly not. Nor did I ever think I would have to remember anything about something that happened half my lifetime ago.
Before we get into it, because I've got questions, I'm sure the folks here have questions, and the internet has questions, and you are the only person who has answers. How did you get involved with The Wiz?
I had designed a few films for the director of The Wiz, Sidney Lumet, and had by then become a very close friend. And he was approached by Motown, I think originally, and told that Diana Ross had had a dream in which she was Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, yes, and she would like very much to play the role in the movie version of The Wiz. And Sidney said, so that seems to be going to happen, and we're going to have Dorothy be played by Diana. And of course, Diana Ross was a big enough star at that time that it would permit a decent budget for a movie that would not otherwise have got any kind of budget at all, because black movies, least of all black musical movies, didn't get that much of an audience at the time. So I said to Sidney, so we're not even going to have a child to get into the fantasy sequences through. He said, no, but she'll be a school teacher. She'll be somebody aware of a childlike mind. And I said, Sidney, I hope you'll forgive me, but I think this comes very low on your list of terrific ideas. And God bless him, he said, but secretly, I'm excited about doing it because my kids, that his two daughters, Amy and Jenny, have one of the all-time most remarkable grandmothers that any kid could hope for, Lena Horne, the great jazz and blues singer. They've got a great beauty. And he said, and I'm picturing Lena as the good witch up in the sky, singing to her granddaughters, my kids, singing, believe in yourself. What a way to get going in a young life. And I said, well, I'm going to feel like a swine if I step away from that wish. And he said, also, you and I know that most of the films that I make are made in Manhattan, and I would love the opportunity to, instead of doing a kind of more cops and robbers or kind of grubby, gritty movies, like to make a sort of Valentine to the city of New York and the surroundings. So that was appealing too, although I couldn't imagine quite how it was going to work. You've got a man, the lion, in a furry suit, walking naked through a familiar street setting with garbage cans and so forth around. That's very hard to pull off. But it was also very challenging, which made it extraordinarily exciting. What made it even more exciting and terrifying was that Universal, who by then were co-presenting the movie with Motown, had a series of contracts from which they had come to believe that they could only, the rights could only remain with them provided the film was finished by such and such a date, which was roughly 15 weeks total, 12 weeks of shooting and about 3 weeks ahead to design it and get it going and find the locations and everything. So that was put a bit of energy under us, and originally I said, but Sydney, even though I've always designed the costumes for the films that we've collaborated on before, I think I shouldn't. I think just even the production design alone is going to be so challenging for me that I shouldn't do the costumes. And so he asked the original costume designer of the show, the brilliant Jeffrey Holder, who had taken over the direction and the choreography on the stage show, if he would do the costumes for the movie. And alas, that didn't quite work out for God knows what reasons. Perhaps Jeffrey was still so connected to the theatrical costumes that he didn't make enough of a change for Sydney. So Sydney came to me and said, sorry to do this to you, but you're going to have to do the costumes as well. And I said, well, if I do, could I get the two biggest chunks of costumes, which don't involve the principals, could I get them done by others? And he said, what are you thinking? And I was just thinking, well, you know, we're going to have nearly 4,000 costumes in the Emerald City, because it goes from emerald to red to gold. And so every one of the 1,200 members that are dancing in that sequence is going to have 3 separately colored costumes. And I was thinking, maybe I could go to the great 7th Avenue designers like Halston and so on and say, would you make your current line, or whatever line you're next thinking of doing, would you be prepared to make it in our palette and in our fabrics? And you will get a very substantial credit in the movie, which will be, of course, great advertising for you. And somewhat to my astonishment, they agreed. And most of them did recreate their own line in our colors and our fabrics. A couple of them, especially Norma Kamali, made brand new, solely for the Wiz costumes, which then became her Wiz line. But we got that huge costume sequence for free, so to say, which would have cost a fortune if I had designed them and they had had to be made. And similarly, with the Poppy girls, the street walkers who lead our heroes into Poppy heaven, as it were, into the drug area of New York's theater district. I knew that Joel Schumacher, the writer of the screenplay, had at one time been a young and somewhat successful fashion designer. So I asked him if he would do all the Poppy gals, and he was thrilled to be asked. So I managed to shift these 2 huge chunks of challenges, you know, a total of maybe over 4,000 designs. I managed to shift them elsewhere and focus mainly on the principles. So,
Well, speaking of things to live up to, the movie had a lot to do to stand on its own. The Broadway production won 7 Tony Awards. It was a smash hit. In the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz...
The stage production of the movie.
In the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz is a cultural juggernaut. It established the idea of Oz for 2 generations.
Yes.
When you approached the designs for the film, did you find the history of those pieces daunting, or did they weigh on you, or did they buoy you? Did you allow them to...
It was very clear that because it was hopefully going to celebrate Black life in New York, that nothing about the look of the original movie would be relevant, really. And Sydney had said from the word go, I don't want it to have any rural aspects. Even the Scarecrow's field of corn needs to be something that you might come across in the city, in the scruffy slums of the city. And so needing to make that shift was enough of a sort of mind change not to need to research the original movie, although I was always an incredible fan of that film. But we started elsewhere, and we went and scoured the city for possible locations and so forth. And that led us into the route we finally took with the costumes. And I took the sketches. I think you may have seen some in the movie, right? These sketches. I see the lion and the whiz there. I took them to the gal who was going to make them, the great Barbara Matera. And she said, Tony, I'm looking at the Tin Man. Is the Tin Man here somewhere? Yeah. And I'm thinking, well and good, I can try and make that, but I don't know what it looks like from behind. And I don't think that any of the costume research books that we have in our libraries are going to show me anything useful to lead us to know how to make what you've designed. So it would be very helpful to me if you could make them in 3 dimensions, so we could see all the way around and figure out how to make them. I'm sure you can't see any details here, but there's a little license plate hanging on his butt and things like that. That actually turned out to be soothing for me, making clay versions of these models. The ones that we're looking at here, I borrowed from Sidney Lumet's widow, because I'd had these bronze versions cast and made as a sort of farewell gift to the characters and to Sidney. I gave them to him. And they live in his widow's dining room now. And she said, you should have them with you when you're going to Washington. So I'd forgotten quite how heavy they were.
And they are very heavy.
You just try.
He packed them all together in one bag.
Try and lift the lion with one hand.
Thank you. So I hope you all are with me when I say I love The Wiz. It is more than just a movie. It was an introduction to perspective, how to see things, how to see beauty and whimsy in the world around me. I was born and raised in Washington in the 80s, and so much of The Wiz looks like the city I grew up in. But it wasn't until I saw The Wiz for the first time that I learned how to look at my surroundings with new eyes. Your ability to take the world in around you and twist it just enough, is really something to marvel in. And looking at your other works like Chicago and Grand Hotel, Orient Express, would you say that this immersive envisioning is something you've done over the course of your career? And what was your process for designing the physical world of The Wiz?
Well,
It's a
although
very
there are
big
many
question.
things that are similar about the process, by the time I came to work on The Wiz, I had discovered that there was a real risk to working in a comfortably familiar vein for me. I'd had an exhibition very early on in London at a very fancy St. James Gallery, and luckily it had gone well, so that when I went to say goodbye to all my designs that were heading off to the purchasers, I was sort of flabbergasted to see this sort of visual sensibility that wafted through everything in those years. This was in the 1950s. And I made up my mind then and there that if I should continue more or less in this somewhat high style, hopefully slightly witty, curvilinear vein, that I would possibly become bored with my profession, with the similarity of one production after the next. And so I made up my mind to try to start from a fresh place every time, to see if I could find another version of this little twerp from Walton on Thames that could surprise even me by not seeming to have been done by my natural gifts. And so everything has started from a different point of view. Incidentally, I don't know how many of you can see it, but Solomon is wearing a T-shirt with the the head of Michael Jackson as the Scarecrow. And one wonderful side issue of doing something like this is that you go into a costume fitting with Michael Jackson. I had actually worked with him as that angelic kid in a TV special called Free to Be You and Me. And he had sung a song called, I think it was called I Love What You Look Like, Please Don't Change. And Roberta Flack sang that. So the end of the number, in which they, as little children, doing dress up in the attic, she says to Michael Jackson, I love what you look like, please don't change. That must have given him a very bad idea. But I was so lucky because I thought, I'm sure he's going to object to the fact that I've given him a chocolate wrapper as a nose. And I said, I hope you're not upset or offended by any of these aspects of this costume. And he said, no, I'm most particularly grateful that you give me something to wrap my nose in, because my dad is always mocking me, and he and my brother call me Big Nose all the time. And they even taunt me, you ugly, ugly, ugly Big Nose. So that was one of his sort of motives, heartbreaking. But it was a piece of luck for me that I could get away with the chocolate wrapper.
So the movie begins with a Tony Walton original. That's this, I think it's this one. No, wait, where'd it go? It's over there. Yeah. So that's the establishing shot at the top of the movie. What inspired that mural?
Well, when we were trying to decide on the area of Harlem in which Dorothy's home would be placed and where her family would be having a big dinner in the opening sequence of the movie, it just so happened that across the street from the house that we settled on was a bare wall, a building that had been sliced in half, and the sort of raw half where it had been sliced was just battered bricks. And so betwixt us, Sydney and I thought, why don't we use, for the title sequence, a mural that hopefully conveys or sets up in some way most of the elements that we're going to be dealing with in the course of telling the story. So I'm not sure if you can tell, but is there a rainbow there? I think, yes. Under the rainbow there, for obvious reasons.
And a taxi cab.
Is the witch, the good witch, Lena Horne, and all the babies amongst whom eventually we would presume to see Sydney's kids. Is that what's in front of me here? Well,
this is the playground.
Oh,
yeah.
We don't have
the murals over there.
We don't have the good witch with the babies all around.
Oh, it's here.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
So you can sort of see a very naive kind of sidewalk artist version of Glenda and the babies floating under the rainbow there. And there are other elements that were teases of little sequences that would be coming. And actually I had a very good time doing that because I could be a lot sloppier than doing the actual pieces that would eventually need to be designed.
You can't see it, but at the bottom there's a note to the scenic charge. Keep the blockish texture of the painting.
Well, the brick texture, allow it to survive through the colors. And actually, the eventual costume for Lena Horne, who I was a worshipper of, turned out to be a rather dangerous thing because I had several layers on her, some of them semi-transparent, and had grain of wheat lights that had stained in different tones of blues and violets and lavenders and so on, threaded through her costume. So her twinkling would actually be able to happen from the lights in her costumes. It so happened that when we filmed the sequence, the battery pack that she was wearing on her butt to power all these grain of wheat lights in some way started to burn her butt. And she got through and completed the number without calling for help. But she did actually have quite a bad burn. Luckily nowhere that anyone would be likely to see it. And of course she's the showbiz pro of all time and just decided the show must go on despite having that predicament. The other thing I remember about that sequence is once we got all the babies in their flying harnesses and their sort of heavenly costumes up into the air, it only took, we had some very young babies up there, and it only took a few moments before one of them started to cry from discomfort with the flying harness or something. And of course that was infectious and all the babies would start to cry. And Sydney went, oh. And we were trying to think what we should do when my associate art director said, did anyone bring the tranquilizer darts? But we couldn't descend to that, so they finally were calmed down. And during the time it took to calm them down, Sydney said, let's just quickly shoot a close-up on the silver slippers. And everything gradually got quieter and quieter, and the camera was focused right on Diana's feet. It just so happened that Richard Pryor, not in costume, but as Richard Pryor, was watching the shoot. He was very interested to see what our heaven was going to look like. And he was the only sound that happened before the clicking of the heels. And he said, this is, many of you may remember from some of the infamous old radio shows, Step and Fetch It and so on. He said, feet, do your stuff. Which was a good way to cheer everybody up. And then luckily.
So the movie starts with a little bit of 1970s realism, and then we're thrust into the magical world of Oz. Can you talk to us about the creation of Munchkinland and the selection of the New York State Pavilion and the Tent of Tomorrow for that scene?
Of selection of...
The tent
right. Well, the screenwriter, Joel Schumacher, I think even in the original Broadway version of the show, the first witch that Dorothy meets is Miss One, and she's a numbers runner. And so all her graffiti city critters, costumes are made from numbers. And
did you all catch that in the movie? I've seen this movie 200 times, I swear to God. And I was watching it, and only once I saw, I don't think we have them up here, the sketches for the kids with their giant numbers, was I able to look at the movie and go, oh, that's what they're wearing. That's crazy. Sorry.
And of course, Miss One herself is wearing numbers
yes.
throughout her crystal hair. So I hope I'm answering this, but the fact that she was Miss One and her kids were numbers runners led me into a very easy series of choices. And when we decided that Diana, as Dorothy, needed to crash through a huge glittering sign that said Oz, she had to fly, as it were, into Oz, we saw at the time was now a skating rink, but as Solomon had said, had been the city of the future and the Wells Fair of 1960s. And it had the big oval as a sign in the middle of this arena. with all the wires coming from the circular space, holding it up. And I don't remember whether it was Sydney or me said, wouldn't it be great if we could zap a Z into the middle of that oval and have it say Oz, so that...
And there we go.
There
Oz.
we go.
Done.
Yes, yeah.
Easy. After Munchkinland, Dorothy walks through the wasteland of Brooklyn, meeting the Scarecrow on the way. Of the characters in The Wiz, one that stands out as the most inventive and divergent from The Wizard of Oz and from the original stage production is the Scarecrow. The 1975 script for The Wiz, the Scarecrow says, "They took the jacket and pants, found a brown paper bag, and filled it with straw." But Joel Schumacher's script for the film references his garbage guts. Looking at the first roughs, which we have in the collection of the design for that costume, it looked like you were incorporating garbage from a very early standpoint. Where did the idea come from, and how did you select the pieces, particularly the very clever popcorn bucket?
Oh, thank you. That was it. Well, at the time, I didn't know Michael Jackson was going to be the Scarecrow, so you probably remember some of the roughs make no attempt to seem like Michael. But I did think I had to somehow achieve his costume through garbage bags. And as you know from the script, the garbage bags are mostly filled with paper, sort of chopped up paper that's been through the, what are they called? The
Shredder?
Yes. You know, the shredder, I imagine, by now is very hard at work in Washington. It wasn't there.
He said it. I did. I work here.
Yeah. So all the quotes that the Scarecrow finds from his garbage bags are quotes from some of my unloved classical heroes like Cicero. You know.
There are a lot of iconic moments in The Wiz and a lot of historical landmarks that we are familiar with, even if you've twisted them just a little bit, like the 4 Chrysler buildings. But there is a mystery.
Actually, there were 5 Chrysler buildings.
There were 5 Chrysler buildings? Oh, I can't count.
You have to have a
sure
central
are.
one.
The one in the middle, that's right. But there is a mystery that the internet can't even solve. Is the bridge for Ease On Down the Road based on an actual bridge?
Yes,
and
it
where
actually
is
is the Flushing Bridge. And
internet, it is. Just saying.
And actually, you might have fun spotting an accident that happened and is still evident in the movie. I don't think I've talked to you about this. So we used the actual bridge and the lampposts from the bridge itself and the Congolium, linoleum, yellow brick road spread across the bridge. And I designed a couple of sort of ratty-looking fences to hide the Long Island Expressway, which is visible either side of the bridge. If you just set up the camera and look at the bridge, you'd be looking at the traffic. So those fences are blotting out the traffic. And the Chrysler buildings, which in my sketch, I don't know if they're here, were a number of photos that I took of it at different sizes and pasted onto the sketch. And the fabulous special effects matte painter who worked on the movie duplicated the look of the 5 Chrysler buildings on a huge sheet of glass that was sitting on top of the horizontal portion of the little fences that lead into the bridge. Cool. And because we wanted to use the lights within the lamps on the bridge, he had to paint, eventually, the whole city that's the other side, which supposedly shows both the upcoming Oz and the cyclone in Coney Island. He had to leave little gaps for where the actual lampposts were going through his painting. And it started to rain. And
of course.
We had to take the huge sheet of glass and put it under cover And by the time it came back, we were never quite able to line up the big painted sheet of glass with the actual lampposts. So you'll see the bottom portion of them starts fine, and then there's a little jog, and the rest of it continues up. And that's why why the lamps are not quite perfect verticals.
Well, that just ruins the movie.
That's what makes it for me.
And then we end up on the edge of the borough in Coney Island. It is not the most efficient route from Flushing to World Trade. But hey, it's an adventure. It's an adventure movie, right? And we're thankful for it. Your set for Coney Island is probably the most visually stunning of them all, at least for me. It is jam filled with carnival and vaudeville, and every element works to support one another. What was your inspiration for the setting of that scene, and what sort of research did you do?
Well, the carnival is a world I love, and one of the first things that popped into my mind that it would be nice to have a little backup group, 3 gorgeous backup singers, be the actual carvings in one of the carnival wagons. And I'm sure you've noticed, and many other people may have noticed, that they are actually carved figures until Nipsey Russell in Slide Some Oil to Me needs a bit of doo-wah backing. And suddenly these carved ladies open up and start to sing.
And 12-year-old Solo was freaked out by that moment. And I think everybody was Michael Jackson, who just looks up and goes, what? What is happening?
And also the ball toss heads behind the platform on which Nipsey and Dorothy and the Scarecrow dance also have big open mouths for the balls to be tossed into, but they also get to sing back up the next season.
Everybody gets a part in
Yes.
Coney Island. The Tin Man's origin himself is a creation, as a creation for the amusement park, is another invention for the film.
And as I say, although I wasn't aware of it at the time, when the gentleman who wrote the book about my stuff got to that sequence, he said, but isn't it obvious that this comes from these political figures that you made out of tin cans and drowned? I said, oh my goodness, it hadn't crossed my mind, you know.
He does look put together by actual bits and pieces of metal.
Yes.
It's
There
just a really
are, of
good
course,
design.
this is not something an audience needs to think about, but there's a very big predicament to having a costume made out of tin cans and stuff. Not
It's
so bad
heavy.
in the theater, because you like hearing the noise it makes, but in the movie, unwanted clangs and clinks while the Scarecrow is speaking or moving are out of the question. So all of the pieces of his costume are molds made from real tin cans and then made in sort of lightweight foam rubber so that they would not make any noise banging into each other.
It's so good, right? Anybody notice that it's not real metal? I had no idea. When you're inventing a character like that, what do you consider to be some of the more important things when you're designing?
Some of it is given you in that he doesn't have a heart, so you need a place to find out that it's empty in there, you know? Things like that. But he also has, and the song he sings has a very, very strong connection to the world of vaudeville, even to some extent to minstrelsy. And one of the challenges for me was that this was a very political time when we were making the movie. And
Not like today.
no.
Not political at all.
So there were moments, and I was very conscious that I was trying to bring the full lifetime of black entertainment into the history that's being the background to the story. So in the carnival background, there are collaged are a lot of minstrelsy posters. And I'm trying to remember, I think it was Nipsey Russell, the Tin Man, said, that was such a dark time in our history. People, black people had to black up. I would not have been considered sufficiently black to be a minstrel, so I would have had to put boot polish on in order to be acceptable as a minstrel. And Ted Ross, the Lion, said, "But that's our real history. That's what the story was for us as entertainers. If we wanted to do that and be there, we had to go through these embarrassments, and we shouldn't leave that out. It's very important to our background." But it was an interesting tightrope to try and walk through. Of course, the most revolting are the flying monkeys.
Oh, I love the flying monkeys. Cheetah's so cute.
But that, in that case, I said, Sidney says they have to be frightening. They have to look frightening. And I said, aren't we going to resent the fact? Aren't people going to resent the fact? Certainly, a white, not even American, designer is caricaturing this kind of very broad-featured black face with big lips and so on. He said, what you have to think of is that they need to be taste-free. Without taste of any sort, so that we don't consider them to be in poor taste or anything, So I rode that little slogan for a while, but I still get uncomfortable at times looking at the flying monkeys and some of the Winkies, who, because they need to be grotesque and put upon, the ones just in front of the flag, and they need to have enough stuff on them so that when they are freed, and it's a brand new day, freedom is here, you see, as the song goes, we can get rid of that mess of stuff that they've been living in through all the time that they've been subservient to the Wicked Witch.
It's very interesting that you bring that up. I was watching, in preparation for this, forced to watch the movie every day. I couldn't stand it. No, it's great. And having watched it so many times as a kid and so many times growing up, watching it with 2018 eyes, finally seeing the Winkies, the workers in Eveline's shop, their costume, I always wondered why their costume was so chunky. Why was there so much to it? And I realized that it's intentional. It's supposed to be oppressive. Mm-hmm. And when they take their outer skin off, mm-hmm. it is a relief of blackness, mm-hmm. a relief of skin and loving yourself. And yes. And I was like, oh, that's what that's about. And even a 2006, I think it's 2006 episode of The Family Guy reprised that scene where everybody there are a group of white characters and they all unzip their faces and they're beautiful black people underneath. I was like, what? But now I understand that scene so much and I appreciate you.
Well, in this TV special, Free to Be You and Me, in which I worked with the very young and adorable Michael, I had wanted to start the thing, or at least a theatrical version of it that we were planning. I wanted to start it with what appeared to be a bunch of stagehands, overweight and lumpy and so forth, playing cards in the middle of the stage, and they would be sort of caught there as the curtain went up. And then as they circled in panic, they would be unzipping these stagehand faces and arms and so forth, and revealing themselves to be the more beautiful Marlo Thomas or whoever it was that were then the real characters. So this was a bit of a memory of that, and I had some fun figuring out where to run the zippers throughout their costumes.
Going a little bit further back, this is a section I called Welcome to the First Annual Emerald City Hunger Games. So after walking from Flushing through the wastelands of Brooklyn to Coney Island, back all the way to Ward's Bridge, into Midtown Manhattan to the library, back across into Brooklyn to the famous Hoyt subway station for some nightmare fuel, which I will never forgive you for those trash cans. A conservative estimate based on the information that you give us in the movie, 49 miles over the course of 2 nights, a hazy stop in the poppy fields of Jane's Carousel, and then across the Brooklyn Bridge, officially the worst Uber ride ever. Finally, in District 1 with all the money, the Capitol, quite obviously, this is one scene that stands out of all of them. The Emerald City sequence is 7 glorious minutes with 3 sections, a cast and the crew. Just tell us again so that when we watch it, we remember how many costumes are there?
There's around 4,000. Give or take. Some of them are things like microphones and cameras and overscale TV equipment. And then there are some guards, but most of them are dancers. Probably over 1,000 dancers changing 3 times, from green to red to yellow to gold. I don't think we have any of them out, and unfortunately we can't put them on display, but there are sketches of the microphones and the camera and the TV camera, and the coolest thing is that you drew a sketch with a little man inside the camera so that the maker will know how the human is supposed to be inside. Yes. There's a real person inside that operating the camera lens. And the microphone person had to stand, I'm going to do it, like this. The entire time they were shooting. I think in the world of understanding, if any of us are creators in the room, the resources available at the library to be able to look at process and how other designers think, I will just say I'm grateful to your donation to the library, and it is a treasure trove. I want to get into the World Trade Center a little bit. The sequence stands as one of the largest and most expensive productions ever filmed at the World Trade Center. But what is most striking is that up until that point, Oz had not been a particularly hospitable city. We had trash cans trying to eat people, wildly different from the clean and beautiful aesthetic of the 1939 film. Suddenly a relief of people, opulence, money, and outlandish design. You got to have a little bit of fun. You enlisted the help of Oscar de la Renta, Norma Kamali, Albert Whitlock, and Stan Winston to create the world that is at once familiar but also fantastic. How did you and Sidney Lumet come to select World Trade as the Emerald City, and what were the inspirations for design? Well, at the time we were preparing the film, it was a very famous, brand new structure. And it had, within the courtyard between the Twin Towers, a pool, a sort of a moat in a circular form or disc form. And we realized that if we put plexiglass in that circular moat, we could light it, a milk plexiglass, we could light it in different colors for each of the fashion color changes. What we didn't think about at the time, because we were not the people who were actually going to have to achieve it, was that the poor guys who loaded in these huge 8x4 sheets of plexiglass were walking between the Twin Towers, coming from the West Side Highway, the river direction, and there was always a serious wind whirling through there. which was later stopped by the hotel being built between the two towers. But at that time, these poor guys take these huge sheets of plexiglass, would have the plexiglass blown out of their hands, up 80, 90,000 feet, and coming down like razor blades, and all of us running in every imaginable suggestion.
Did anybody get hurt?
So, nobody was hurt, miraculously. And Lena was our casualty.
Okay, so this is the section I like to call Tea Whiz. Is there any good gossip? Can you spill any good tea?
Oh. You don't count the Michael Jackson story as gossip?
Oh, that's good. But do you have anything juicy?
There is some. And this is one that hopefully you might be intrigued by and will give you something to think about when you're watching the movie. We started, first day or night of shooting was night shooting in the Emerald City. It was obviously somewhat a choice of Sydney's so that he could get the worst over first while he was at maximum energy, because he would be meeting all these dancers and meeting the principal characters for the first time, including Toto, which up until that time nobody had quite known how that was going to be treated.
She does ditch that dog very early in that scene.
Yes.
Yes, she
Yeah.
does.
Alas, at exactly that moment, so sad because of the reason for Sydney wanting to do the film was having Lena Horne sing to his daughters. The mother of these daughters, who's the daughter of Lena Horne, had decided that she wanted out of the marriage. And her shrink said, well, if you're going to tell him, she said she was very nervous, he would be so upset, so distraught. She said, well, if you're going to tell him when he's involved in something so all-consuming that he hardly even knows what he's hearing. A rather savage suggestion. And in fact, it decimated Sydney. His wife did turn up and did say, I want a divorce. And actually, my blood has turned chill at the memory of it, because the result of it, instead of the information being hidden by all the things he was having to focus on, was that it became the prime and principal thing that he could think about. So when you see the movie, you'll see that during much of the storytelling, from quite early on, almost everybody is crying. And it's a bit puzzling in some instances to know why there are so many tears being shed. But that was the reason. That was Sydney, as a director, was a very empathetic with actors and used to give them his feelings about a scene, convey with physical gestures and grunts and groans his feelings. And he was feeling genuinely miserable. We used to take him home at the end of shooting, which would be at like 5 or 6 in the morning. And my wife, Jen, would drive the car down to pick us up. And he would sit beside her in the front seat. So we're all facing in the same direction so that he knows that we can't see him. And it allowed him to be as emotional as he felt. And it was a very, very difficult time. And it wounded the movie, I have to say. And it isn't until A Brand New Day and freedom, so to say, that he managed to free himself of that. He was, in life, a very cheerful fella. Kids said, really feisty fella. And it was heartrending to see the suffering that he was carrying with him through this. And I think it would have been a more buoyant movie if that hadn't happened. Some of it's okay, because it sort of fits the strange new nature of the story. And certainly it's okay when everybody's released from the, so to say, slavery of the sweatshop. but it was a heavy load for him to carry, and for those of us really close to him emotionally to try to help him with. So now you know something awful.
And that's a little bit of T-Wiz.
Couldn't tell the story, of course, if he was still alive.
Well, I wonder, I've asked a lot of questions, the internet has asked some questions. I wonder if there are any questions in the audience from the folks who are here. And we'll start all the way at the back, because I always sit in the back and I never get to ask my questions. So I think there's one person all the way in the back there.
Hello. Hello, hi. I am so glad that this film is being celebrated because it's one of my favorites. But I do have a question. I lived in Detroit for a period of time, and I met an associate of Berry Gordy's. And he told me that the movie was about Berry Gordy and how he felt about certain things. And so throughout the entire, you've heard this too?
Not true. Berry
Not true?
Gordy had zip, and other than approving Diana, because he was going to have his leading gal from the Broadway show star in the movie and be a great discovery, which wouldn't have happened because she was a brilliant singer, rock and roll singer, but she was not a very pretty gal. So when Diana usurped the role, she was already in a very touchy relationship with Berry Gordy. And Berry Gordy sort of forced Motown, because of its connection with the stage version, to be involved in the movie. But he was not, none of us, including the screenwriter or Sidney Lumet, ever had a meeting with him in which he was invited to offer an opinion of any sort. If what you're saying is true, that is simply an astonishing coincidence.
Well, I have a couple of coincidences I like to share with everyone. The person that told me the story, he said that he was a bodyguard for Berry Gordy. And he said Berry Gordy sat down with Sidney Lumet away from everybody, miles away. And he said this. He said he cast Diana Ross because he wanted an old Dorothy. And he said he wanted people to know that it's never too late to do what you want. And then he had the scene about family to say that family is the most important thing ever. And so, and that's why her family was trying to make her marry some guy or get with some guy so she could start a family. But then she got lost, and then he said the emerald, and so
let's not spend too much time on this,
Okay,
because I'm sorry to have to say
I don't
that
wanna spend
it's
too much
even
time on it.
more of a fantasy than the movie itself.
Okay, but can I give you two of them? I'll give you two more things. He said that
I'm sure he loved Barry. He may have been the only one who did.
Is there another question? Yeah? Give us 1 second. We're going to do a microphone moment with you.
Thank you for coming. I love the movie. It's been historic. I love Mabel King. If you can tell me a little bit about the miraculous and wonderful Mabel King, who played the Wicked Witch of the West.
She had been the Wicked Witch in Evelyn in the stage production, which of course I had seen. And she was such an ebullient performer, even though she had to be somewhat bad-tempered. That was the clue for me on what to do with her appearance, her costume, which is totally unlike the stage version. And because we wanted to have the Winkies with far too many layers of clothing and being oppressed by their outfits, I needed to make Evelyn sort of the head of that particular looking family. And by coincidence, a great Latin American painter, fine artist, was living close to where my family and I were sort of holidaying on Long Island when I was actually designing the movie. And he had an exhibition, and is she here with us? Yes. So the things that are on that costume, many of them are bits of reproductions of his paintings, chopped up and collaged onto it. And I thought a lot of it would be somewhat bejeweled and enriched and so forth. And then I thought, a bit like our Emerald City problem, that it was going to be far too expensive to use bejeweled items to collage on her. So I thought, what if we bought a lot of dog toys and chopped them up and sort of mimicked the look of these bits and pieces of Osorio's paintings. So that's how that came about. But she was another of the people who got sort of politically empowered to decide how much of the black performer's history could be embraced in the movie without it seeming to be demeaning. So it was fascinating. She and Ted Ross, who had been in the stage version, were the ones who most championed having the history of black entertainers and performers be evident in the film. I'm not sure I've really covered her well, but the energy she brought to the role in, or even especially in the stage version, was so appealing that I felt I had to sort of rise to her level with her appearance. I don't know if that means anything.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here with us today. This is one of my all-time favorite movies. I mean, every time it comes on, I watch it. I was just looking at your sketches over here, and one of the more frightening scenes in the movie was the puppeteer and the marionettes.
Right.
And as they grew, how did you come up with that concept?
I'm so sorry, I missed the sequence.
The puppeteer and the marionette scene.
Right.
That was a little disturbing, and I was just wondering how you came up with that concept.
I'm sorry to say this is part of my own sort of carnival and vaudevillian affections, perhaps I should call it an inescapable part of my sort of visual makeup, the world of carnival and the world of vaudevillians. And so when, I'm not sure if it was Cinematt or Joel, the screenwriter, said, we need to find ways to make the subway sequence more terrifying than I've written it. I said, well, maybe we could have a subway peddler and he could have some tiny little scary things on his tray, and we could have 3 little dancing paper dolls that were accordion legs and arms and so on, have them grow up and become a terrifying size and then pursue the characters. So I plead guilty to having popped them in there, and I do apologize.
Well, I would like to thank you very much for taking a little bit of time to talk to us about this movie. Yeah, totally.
Thank you.
We are going to take a little break, and then we're going to watch The Wiz. It's going to be awesome. Once again, folks, Tony Walton, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.